when a young, pregnant fiancée publicly humiliated her millionaire boyfriend's ex-wife by calling her a barren, withered vine. The ex-wife didn't cry. She didn't even blink. Everyone thought she was utterly broken. But she was silently holding on to a devastating, decades-old secret that was about to destroy the arrogant CEO's entire life. Why did she stay so perfectly quiet? And what was she hiding? Stick around, because this story takes a turn absolutely nobody sees coming. To see exactly how this unforgettable payback unfolds, make sure to stay with me until the very end. Before we dive in, please take a quick second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. I absolutely love seeing where my viewers are located around the world. Now, let's get into the story. The clinking of Baccarat crystal echoed to the grand tasting room of Viridian Estates, followed by a wave of polite, wealthy applause. Standing at the center of the room, bathed in the warm glow of the chandeliers, was Julian. He held a bottle of the estate's crown jewel, a masterpiece vintage, up to the light as if he had pulled it from the earth with his bare hands. He spoke to the crowd of local elite, his voice thick with the practiced arrogance of a self-made man. He spun a polished tale of building this luxury empire from the dirt up, boasting about his unyielding vision and how he had conquered the wine industry entirely on his own. Clinging to his arm was Serena, his much younger, heavily pregnant fiancée, her hand resting proudly on her stomach, a diamond the size of an almond sparkling on her finger. The crowd drank in every word, but in the dimly lit VIP lounge just steps away, the atmosphere was about to turn freezing. Sitting alone on a velvet sofa, quietly sipping a glass of sparkling water, was Helena, Julian's ex-wife, the woman who had spent 2 decades walking through fire beside him. Serena spotted her. The younger woman's lips curled into a cruel, triumphant smile. With the confidence of someone who believes they have already won the war, Serena stepped forward. Her voice cut to the soft jazz playing in the background, projecting loudly enough to ensure the most influential people in the county heard every single syllable. "It must be absolute torture for you to be here," Serena sneered, her eyes locking on to Helena. "Looking at this estate, looking at my growing family. But then again, Julian always said a man needs a real harvest to build a legacy, not a withered, barren vine that couldn't bear fruit." The room went dead silent. The musicians faltered and stopped playing. Wealthy investors and socialites froze, their eyes darting between the three of them. It was a humiliation so profound, so devastatingly public, that several guests physically winced. Everyone waited for Julian to intervene, to show a single shred of decency to the woman who had shared his hardest years. Instead, Julian simply smirked. He let out a soft, dismissive laugh, wrapped his arm tighter around Serena's waist, and kissed her cheek. He offered not a single word in Helena's defense. The silence hung heavy, suffocating the room. People expected Helena to break. They expected tears, a screamed insult, or a frantic, humiliated retreat out the heavy oak doors. They got none of that. Helena did not flinch. She did not cry. She slowly lowered her crystal glass to the table, the ice clinking softly against the sides. She looked at Serena's smug face, then at Julian's arrogant grin, with a chilling, absolute calm. It was a terrifying kind of dignity. Her dark eyes held no sorrow, no anger, only the quiet, unnerving patience of a woman watching someone walk blindly toward the edge of a cliff. The onlookers felt a deep, unsettling chill wash over them. They thought they were looking at a defeated woman who had lost her marriage, her legacy, and her future. But they were entirely wrong. There was a buried truth hiding beneath the sprawling vineyards and the arrogant toasts. A truth that neither the smug pregnant fiancée nor the boastful CEO even knew existed. And the moment it finally surfaced, Julian's entire world was going to be violently uprooted. To understand how a man could be so dangerously blind, you have to look past the crystal chandeliers and the designer suits, all the way back to the rotting soil where this empire began. 2 decades earlier, Viridian Estates wasn't a luxury destination. It was a dying, bankrupt plot of land bought on a prayer. Back then, Julian was nothing more than a desperate dreamer with empty pockets and a silver tongue. He had the vision, but Helena had the genius. She was a master botanist, a brilliant mind whose callous hands literally coaxed life out of barren earth. While Julian practiced his sales pitches in a modest farmhouse kitchen, Helena was out in the freezing rain, mapping soil chemistry, grafting roots, and quietly engineering the complex wine blends that would eventually make them famous. Then came the devastation. A merciless agricultural blight swept through the valley, choking the life out of their vines and turning their harvest to ash. The financial fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Debts piled up faster than they could open the notices. Suppliers demanded cash up front. Foreclosure loomed like a storm cloud. Faced with the total collapse of his grand dream, Julian's bravado completely evaporated. Panic consumed him. The charismatic leader vanished, replaced by a terrified man ready to pack a suitcase, file for bankruptcy, and abandon the ruin. But Helena refused to let their life's work wither away. Swallowing her pride, she made a quiet, agonizing journey back to the one place she had sworn to leave behind. Her estranged family. They possessed old, quiet wealth, the kind of generational money that survived because it was completely ruthless about preservation. Her family listened to her plea and agreed to clear the crippling debt, but they delivered one non-negotiable condition. The estate had to be entirely shielded from Julian's reckless optimism. It required a complete legal restructuring. The vineyard would be folded into a blind trust, fortified by ironclad corporate documents, leaving Helena with absolute, undisputed, sole control of the assets. When Helena returned with a team of corporate attorneys, Julian was drowning in terror. The bank was days away from padlocking the gates. Handed a stack of documents hundreds of pages deep, Julian didn't pause to hire his own counsel. He didn't read a single clause, condition, or footnote. Desperate to save his own skin, he simply grabbed a pen and feverishly signed his name on every dotted line they placed in front of him, unknowingly signing away the very empire he claimed to love. The capital flowed in. The soil was healed. The vines thrived once more. And as the years passed, producing one award-winning vintage after another, a dangerous transformation took hold. The millions rolled in. The lifestyle magazines came calling, and Julian's ego swelled to match his bank account. With every glowing interview and every lavish party, he slowly rewrote history in his own mind. He convinced himself that his brilliance alone had saved them. He completely forgot the midnight panic. He forgot the bailout. Most dangerously of all, he completely forgot the mountain of paperwork buried deep in a corporate vault, quietly waiting for the day he would push his luck too far. The thunderous applause in the grand tasting room snapped the present reality back into focus. Up on the raised mahogany stage, Julian was leaning into the microphone, soaking in the adoration of the county's wealthiest investors. He raised his glass to the chandeliers, delivering a speech meticulously stripped of Helena's existence. He spoke of the sleepless nights he had spent in the dirt, the exhaustive botanical alchemy he had supposedly mastered, and the sheer force of what it took for him to craft this award-winning vintage. It was a flawless, intoxicating symphony of lies. Standing in the shadowed alcove near the oak barrels, Helena listened to her ex-husband erase her life's work. Yet, she was not the only one suffocating under the weight of his audacity. Near the edge of the stage stood the estate's veteran cellar master and the head of agriculture, men whose hands were as weathered and stained as Helena's used to be. As Julian boasted about formulating the complex notes of the wine, the two men exchanged a loaded, pained glance. They remembered the bitter winters. They remembered who had actually bent over the microscopes and grafted the fragile roots while Julian was away courting distributors. They knew the true architect of Iridian Estates was standing silently in the shadows, but in this room of billionaires and sycophants, the truth was an unwanted guest. Meanwhile, Serena was holding court near the ice sculptures, basking in the glow of her impending motherhood. She gently rubbed her pregnant stomach, accepting the fawning compliments of the investors' wives, projecting the perfect image of the new estate matriarch. But Helena, ever the quiet observer, kept her gaze fixed on the younger woman. Decades of tending to fragile ecosystems had taught Helena how to spot the invisible signs of rot before a vine ever withered. Now, those same sharpened instincts were zeroed in on her ex-husband's fiancée. As the wives turned their attention to the auction catalog, Serena took a subtle step back from the group. She slipped a second inconspicuous phone from her designer clutch, not the expensive device she had been flaunting all evening. Helena watched as Serena glanced at the glowing screen. For a fraction of a second, the smug, triumphant mask slipped entirely. Raw, unadulterated panic flashed across the younger woman's face. Her knuckles turned white. She frantically typed a response, her chest rising and falling rapidly, before hastily shoving the device back into her purse and plastering on a rigid, artificial smile to rejoin the conversation. Helena did not move, but the temperature in her gaze shifted. It was a fleeting moment, a microscopic crack in an otherwise perfect facade, but was enough. A woman secure in her victory, carrying the heir to a multi-million-dollar empire, does not carry a hidden burner phone, nor does she look at a text message with the sheer terror of a cornered animal. A quiet, dangerous seed of suspicion took root in Helena's mind. The narrative Julian had so proudly constructed was built on fragile glass, and Helena was beginning to see exactly where to tap. To anyone watching Helena at the gala, her silence in the face of such a vicious insult was baffling. Why would a woman of her intellect and composure allow herself to be publicly branded as a withered, barren vine without uttering a single word in her own defense? The answer lay buried a decade deep, hidden within the sterile, fluorescent-lit walls of a high-end fertility clinic. It had been a brutal winter 10 years prior. After years of quiet heartbreak, endless injections, and agonizing false hopes, their specialist had finally completed a comprehensive genetic and physical workup on them both. That afternoon, Julian had stepped out of the consultation room to take a call with a distributor, his patience with the medical process wearing dangerously thin. Left alone, Helena was handed a sealed manila envelope by the lead physician. The doctor's eyes held a heavy, sympathetic sorrow as he softly explained that the results were conclusive. Helena opened the envelope and scanned the dense medical terminology until her eyes locked onto the final, undeniable summary. It wasn't her. It had never been her. Julian was completely and irreversibly sterile. The condition was absolute. There was zero biological possibility of him ever fathering a child. Sitting in that cold, quiet room, clutching the paperwork that fully exonerated her, Helena looked through the window and saw Julian pacing the clinic's courtyard. She remembered the terrified, broken man he had been during the agricultural blight. She knew exactly how dangerously fragile his ego was beneath the tailored suits. His entire identity was fiercely tethered to his perception of his own virility, his legacy, and his carefully curated image as a powerful patriarch. The near bankruptcy had almost shattered his mind. This biological revelation would permanently destroy him. So, in a quiet, devastating act of profound love, Helena made a monumental sacrifice. She folded the medical report, slipped it into the depths of her leather purse, and locked the truth away. When Julian walked back into the room, demanding to know what the doctor had found, Helena looked the man she loved in the eye and lied. She took the entirety of the blame. She told him her body had failed him. For over a decade, she swallowed the bitter poison of that decision. She endured the pitiful glances from high society. She sat silently through countless dinners while wealthy wives offered her unsolicited, condescending advice. Worst of all, she absorbed Julian's slow, creeping resentment. She watched him pull away, watched him look at her not as the brilliant architect of his fortune, but as a flawed, inadequate woman who was selfishly denying him his rightful legacy. She let him despise her, she let him divorce her, and she let him replace her, all so he could continue walking tall. But as Serena proudly flaunted her swollen belly at the gala, the tragic irony of Helena's silent burden was rapidly shifting from a selfless sacrifice into the catalyst for total destruction. A few days after the charity gala, Julian was flying high on the intoxicating fumes of his own perceived invincibility. The applause of the elite still rang in his ears, but his ambition was shifting into a dangerous new gear. Serena's whispers in the dark had grown increasingly demanding. Between scrolling through designer catalogs, she spoke incessantly of a sprawling coastal villa in Tuscany, private aviation, and a multi-million-dollar trust fund worthy of the heir she was supposedly carrying. Driven by an insatiable greed and the desperate need to appease his much younger fiancée, Julian made a reckless, irreversible move. He quietly initiated negotiations to sell a 40% stake in Viridian Estates to a ruthless, faceless corporate conglomerate, a massive entity known throughout the industry for buying up heritage brands, stripping them down to the studs and mass-producing their legacy into cheap oblivion. It was a deal that would flood Julian's personal offshore accounts with liquid capital, effectively trading the very soul of the vineyard for a massive, immediate cash payout. Drunk on the prospect of unimaginable wealth, Julian ordered his secretary to summon the executive board for an emergency meeting, fully intending to ram the aggressive buyout through before anyone could mount a defense. While Julian polished his vanity in his sunlit office, preparing to sell off the soil he had never truly bled for, a very different kind of meeting was taking place deep underground, far below the grand tasting room. In the damp, limestone confines of the estate's original aging cellar, Helena stood surrounded by dust-covered casks of forgotten vintages. The air down there was thick with the scent of oak, patience, and fermented earth. Stepping out of the shadows was a discreet, highly recommended private investigator she had retained the morning after the gala. The fleeting, panicked glance Serena cast at that burner phone had been the only thread Helena needed to pull. Now, the entire tapestry of the young woman's carefully constructed lie was unraveling. The investigator did not speak. He simply stepped forward and slid a thick, heavy manila dossier across the surface of a dormant wine barrel. Helena opened the file. The dim, flickering glow of the cellar sconces illuminated pages of financial transcripts, decrypted message logs, and high-resolution surveillance photographs. As she methodically turned the pages, her sharp, analytical mind pieced the ugly puzzle together with terrifying precision. Serena was not merely an opportunistic social climber chasing a comfortable life. The young woman was actively living a dangerous, calculated deception. The dossier painted a meticulously documented picture of hidden offshore accounts, covert meetings in luxury hotel lobbies, and a shadow life that completely shattered the image of the devoted, glowing mother-to-be. Helena closed the folder, the heavy cardboard slapping softly against the aged wood the barrel. Julian was currently marching toward a boardroom, believing he was the undisputed king of the world, completely unaware that he was eagerly handing over a kingdom he didn't own. For a child he couldn't create, alongside a woman who was actively destroying him. The atmospheric pressure had dropped to zero. The storm was finally prepared to break. The atmosphere inside the executive boardroom was electric with greed. Seated at the head of a sprawling mahogany table, Julian was in his element, flanked by the ruthless, sharp-suited executives of the corporate conglomerate. He laid out his aggressive proposal to sell a 40% stake in Viridian Estates. He spoke with the careless ease of a king dividing his conquered lands, projecting charts and financial forecasts that promised astronomical returns. When he concluded his pitch, he leaned back in his leather chair, laced his fingers together, and brashly instructed the estate's legal team to draft the final transfer papers. He was already visualizing the Tuscan villa and the roaring engines of a private jet. Then, the estate's senior lead attorney, a gray-haired veteran who had managed the vineyard affairs for over 2 decades, stood up. The room fell silent as the lawyer reached into his briefcase and withdrew a single, heavy red folder. He did not pass it to the corporate buyers. He slid it directly across the polished wood until it came to rest perfectly in front of Julian. With a calm, measured voice, the attorney informed the room that the proposed acquisition was dead on arrival. Julian, he explained smoothly, lacked the legal authority to authorize the sale of a single bottle of wine, let alone a 40% stake in the empire. Julian scoffed, an arrogant laugh escaping his lips. He reached for the folder, ready to berate the old man for the interruption. But as he flipped it open, the breath was violently knocked from his lungs. Inside were the heavily authenticated documents from the agricultural blight decades ago. The bailout, the blind trust, the legal restructuring he had been too terrified to read. There, staring back at him in damning black ink, were hundreds of his own hasty, frantic signatures, legally stripping him of all equity and placing Viridian Estates entirely under the sole, undisputed ownership of one person. Helena. Julian's face drained of color, his skin turning the shade of ash. His heart hammered frantically against his ribs as the sheer magnitude of his blindness crashed over him. He was not a king. He was merely a well-paid employee living in a castle his ex-wife allowed him to manage. The illusion of his self-made grandeur shattered into a million pieces on the boardroom floor. Slowly, his trembling gaze lifted from the documents and found Helena, Seated quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table, he braced himself for the explosion. He expected a venomous, triumphant speech. He expected her to scream, to gloat, to finally exact her screaming revenge for the vicious humiliation at the gala. Instead, she offered nothing but absolute, chilling indifference. Helena did not smile. She simply folded her hands on the table, looked the stunned corporate executives in the eye, and formally vetoed the buyout on behalf of the trust. Then her dark, unreadable eyes shifted back to Julian. There was no anger, only the quiet authority of a true sovereign dealing with an unruly subordinate. She spoke just 6 words, her voice steady and perfectly polite, stripping him of whatever dignity he had left. "Go back to your office, Julian." The drive back to the sprawling modern mansion was a blur of blind panic and white-knuckle rage. Julian gripped the steering wheel of his sports car until his hands cramped, the tires screaming against the winding asphalt of the valley. Stripped of his authority, humiliated in front of industry titans, and reduced to a mere employee by the woman he had casually discarded, he was suffocating. He desperately needed an anchor. He needed Serena. He needed to hold her, to feel the reassuring presence of his unborn child, the living proof that he was still a powerful man building a new, untouchable legacy. He threw open the heavy front doors, calling her name, his voice echoing off the cold architecture. But the massive, glass-walled foyer did not offer comfort. It offered chaos. The air was thick with the scent of expensive, spilled perfume. A half-dozen luxury designer suitcases were splayed open across the imported marble floor. Serena was darting frantically between the master suite and the luggage, her face pale, shoving silk garments and velvet jewelry boxes into the bags. She didn't run to him. She didn't even stop. Julian froze, his confusion momentarily stalling his panic. Then his eyes dropped to the center of the pristine quartzite kitchen island. Resting exactly in the middle, stark against the white stone, was a heavy, unmarked manila folder, the dossier from the cellar. He walked toward it slowly, an icy dread settling deep in his chest. He flipped open the thick cover. The first page was a high-resolution surveillance photograph of Serena, her pregnant silhouette clearly visible, wrapped in the arms of an older man, in the private cabana of a coastal resort. Julian's breath hitched. He recognized the man instantly. It was the chief executive officer of the very same corporate conglomerate that had been sitting in his boardroom just an hour ago. Julian tore through the pages, his hands shaking violently as the reality of his existence was systematically dismantled. Decrypted message logs detailed months of quiet corporate espionage. Serena had been secretly feeding the conglomerate internal financial data, acting as a beautiful Trojan horse to help them orchestrate the aggressive buyout. But the most devastating blow was buried in a secondary layer of private communications. The timeline of the pregnancy was heavily discussed. The child Serena was carrying, the heir Julian had so proudly paraded in front of his ex-wife, was never his. It was a calculated biological insurance policy meant to permanently bind her to the conglomerate's billionaire CEO. She had simply been using Julian's lavish lifestyle to comfortably fund her interim waiting period. Julian looked up from the damning pages, his voice breaking as he demanded an explanation. Serena did not weep. She did not beg for forgiveness, nor did she offer a hollow apology. She simply snapped the brass lock on her final suitcase shut. The doting, maternal facade was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a woman who realized the gold mine she was tapping had abruptly run dry. Without a single word, she walked past him, the sharp click of her designer heels echoing mercilessly through the cavernous space. The heavy front door slammed shut behind her, vibrating the tall glass walls. Julian stood completely alone in the center of the vast, hollow foyer, clutching the photographic proof of his own absolute ruin. The empire was an illusion. The heir was a phantom. And the final, most agonizing truth was still waiting in the dark to break him completely. The mansion felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Julian stood in the wreckage of his shattered life, the heavy silence ringing in his ears, driven by a desperate, feverish need to find some semblance of control, some forgotten piece of leverage to pull himself out of the sudden abyss. He began tearing through his home office. He yanked open mahogany drawers, recklessly scattering old financial forecasts and framed accolades across the floor. He needed something to prove he wasn't entirely powerless. His frantic, erratic search eventually drove him upward into the stifling heat of the attic storage, where the remnants of his previous life had been banished. Beneath a heavy canvas tarp, coated in a thick layer of accumulated dust, sat a heavy steel lockbox. It belonged to Helena. It was a forgotten casualty of the divorce, left behind in the bitter, hasty division of their assets. With trembling, desperate hands, Julian grabbed a heavy brass bookend from a nearby crate and brought it down violently on the lock. Once, twice, the metal gave way with a sharp, echoing snap. He threw the heavy lid back, expecting to find old journals or perhaps proprietary botanical notes he could use to his advantage. Instead, buried beneath faded, bittersweet photographs of the early vineyard days, he found a thick envelope bearing the crest of the most prestigious fertility clinic in the state. The timestamp across the front was exactly 10 years old. Julian's brow furrowed in confusion. He pulled the heavy, folded parchment from the envelope, his eyes anxiously scanning the dense, clinical text of a comprehensive genetic and biological workup. He traced the lines of data down to the final, unredacted diagnostic conclusion. The words were printed in stark, unforgiving black ink. Male factor infertility. Absolute. Zero biological probability of conception. The paper slipped from his trembling fingers, fluttering to the dusty floorboards like a dead leaf. The realization did not just hit him. It leveled him with the catastrophic, crushing force of an earthquake. The child Serena carried wasn't his, but the truth was infinitely more devastating. He never could have had a child. The grand legacy he had been so desperate to build, the biological heir he felt so inherently entitled to, was a complete and permanent physical impossibility. In the stifling, oppressive quiet of the attic, the agonizing weight of the past decade suddenly crushed the remaining air from his lungs. Memories flooded his mind with a sickening, brutal clarity. He remembered the pitying, whispered conversations of high society. He remembered his own creeping, toxic resentment, the coldness he had shown Helena when he truly believed she was the reason his lineage would die. He remembered standing in the VIP lounge of the gala just days ago, laughing softly while Serena publicly branded her a withered, barren vine. Helena had known. She had possessed the irrefutable medical proof of his absolute inadequacy, yet she had quietly buried it in the dark. She had willingly absorbed the societal shame, the vicious mockery, and the eventual destruction of her own marriage, all to protect his fragile, worthless pride from shattering. She had carried the heavy cross of his failure in total silence, and he had repaid the most profound, selfless loyalty a human being could offer with relentless cruelty and betrayal. Julian fell to his knees on the hard wooden floor, the ashes of his ego finally and permanently scattered. There was no enemy left to fight. The architect of his absolute destruction was himself. The sun had already dipped below the rolling hills of the valley, casting long, bruised shadows across Viridian estates. The property was entirely silent, the workers having long since gone home, when Julian's car crept up the gravel driveway. He did not park in his reserved space by the grand tasting room. Instead, he stopped at the very edge of the property, near the old, humidity-stained glass of the original botanical greenhouse. He was a hollow shell of the man who had stood beneath the chandeliers just days ago. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his arrogant swagger entirely extinguished by the unbearable weight of the truth. He stepped into the heavy, earthy warmth of the greenhouse. The air smelled of damp soil, crushed leaves, and quiet, enduring patience. There, bathed in the dim amber glow of a solitary overhead bulb, was Helena. She wore worn denim and a canvas apron, her bare hands buried deep in the dark earth as she methodically pruned a row of fragile, newly grafted vines. She belonged here, rooted in the reality he had always tried to escape. Julian did not even speak her name. His legs simply gave out. He sank to his knees on the damp gravel path, the sound echoing sharply against the glass panes. A ragged, heavy sob tore through his chest, breaking the tranquil silence. He wept with the absolute, wretched despair of a man who had finally looked into a mirror and realized he was the architect of his own ruin. Between desperate, gasping breaths, the apologies poured from his lips in a pathetic torrent. He confessed to finding the lockbox. He confessed to reading the unredacted medical report. He choked on his own tears as he acknowledged the staggering magnitude of what she had endured, the silent surrender of her reputation, her pride, and her very voice, all to shield a man who had ultimately used that protection to humiliate her. He begged for her forgiveness, his forehead pressed against the cold stones of the pathway, bracing himself for the screaming release of her anger. He deserved her wrath. He craved the punishment of it. But Helena did not scream. She did not throw soil at him, nor did she shed a single tear of vindicated joy. She simply finished tying a delicate green vine to its wooden trellis, slowly wiped her soil-stained hands on a damp cloth, and looked down at him. Her expression was a terrifying, impenetrable calm. It was a dignified stillness that proved far more devastating than any physical blow or screamed insult could ever be. "You came here expecting a reckoning, Julian," she said softly, her voice carrying the smooth, unbothered cadence of water over stone. "But there is no war left for us to fight. You think I orchestrated all of this to ruin you. I didn't." She stepped past him, pausing just for a fraction of a second near his trembling, kneeling form. "I never plotted your destruction," she whispered, her words hanging in the humid air like a heavy mist. "I simply stopped protecting you from reality. And reality is what is breaking you." Without another word, she walked out into the cool evening breeze, leaving him alone in the dirt, weeping bitterly for a harvest he would never, ever possess. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind swept through the valley, bringing the harvest season to Viridian Estates, and a bitter new reality for the man who once claimed to own the sun. Julian was not fired. In a final, devastating act of cold grace, Helena had allowed him to remain on the payroll, but she meticulously stripped away every illusion that had fed his ravenous ego. Gone was the chief executive title, the private boardroom, and the sprawling glass mansion. Today, Julian is a basic regional sales manager. He drives a standard company sedan and lives in a modest, unremarkable apartment. His days are spent hauling heavy sample cases under the harsh, fluorescent lights of mid-tier restaurants, pitching the very wine he once arrogantly auctioned to billionaires. The truest punishment is his complete, inescapable awareness. Every single bottle he touches, every glowing financial review he reads about the estate, is a crushing reminder of the untouchable empire he threw away. He is forced to stand at the absolute bottom of the mountain and watch the vineyard flourish, knowing the kingdom could have been forever, if only he had possessed a single ounce of gratitude. Meanwhile, under the golden afternoon sun, Helena's life has blossomed into something extraordinarily beautiful. She isn't locked away in a sterile corporate office. She is out in the fertile earth where she always belonged. Surrounded by a group of young, passionate agricultural apprentices, she patiently guides their hands as they learn to graft delicate new vines and read the complex chemistry of the soil. She is passing down a lifetime of immense knowledge, nurturing the next generation of botanists with fierce, quiet devotion. She found her harvest. She was never a withered branch. She was a deep, unyielding root system that kept the entire ecosystem alive. In these eager students, she is fulfilling her legacy and her maternal instincts in a profoundly meaningful way, cultivating growth that will easily outlast them all. There's a powerful lesson buried deep in the soil of the story. Never mistake a person's silence for weakness, and never judge someone's worth by a standard they cannot meet. The people who quietly sacrifice the most are often carrying heavy, agonizing burdens solely to protect the ones they love. Pride is a dangerous, blinding toxin. It can completely numb you to loyalty, gratitude, and the brutal truth. If you take for granted the very foundation holding you up, you will inevitably engineer your own total collapse. And by the time reality finally forces your eyes open, the person who once sacrificed everything for you will have already grown far beyond your reach. If the story of silent strength, undeniable truth, and ultimate justice resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a powerful narrative, and subscribe to the channel for more deep, captivating stories. Thank you for watching, and always remember to cherish the unwavering loyalty of those who stand beside you in the dark.